Good evening, everyone, and welcome to New Insights, as always brought to you by the TED, L'Echo, and EY. My name is Emilia Arny, and I will be your host for the next hour. Tonight, we are broadcasting live from the beautiful Old Customs House in Brussels. And for the first time ever, viewers at home or at the office can follow us online. Luckily, the COVID restrictions got a little less severe, so I'm not alone here tonight. We invited a number of young Belgian entrepreneurs to come and listen to our keynote speaker, Professor Mazzucato. Who also is here is Isabelle Albers, Mediafin's very own General Editor-in-Chief of the TED and L'Echo. I'll be checking in on her in just a few minutes. And last but not least, you already heard them, we have live music from the fantastic Compact Disc Dummies, winner of the 2020 Music Industry Award for Best Dance. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Enjoy New Insights. I'm meeting Isabelle in the makeup room. Hello, Isabelle.
Hello.
I can see that you're getting ready for tonight for the show. Are you looking forward to your fireside chat with Mariana?
Of course I am. She's a top economist, and you're not talking to a top economist every day, you know.
That's for sure.
She is as forthright in taking her positions as in expressing them. So we're looking really forward to it.
And what do you want to learn from her?
I want to know all about her insights on that mission economy, and how can we evolve towards a more inclusive and more sustainable capitalism. Yes, that's the question.
Yeah, it sounds like you already have some questions in mind for her later on.
Be sure about that. But I won't be the only one asking questions. People at home or in our audience, they can ask questions too.
Yeah, that's correct. Absolutely, Isabelle. I'll see you later during the fireside chat. And by the way, you look great.
Okay, see you then.
See you then. Well, you heard Isabelle. If you want to ask our Professor Mazzucato a question, you can do so during the entire show. Just under the video player, you will find the Q&A box. Just enter your question there and push the send button. With me are Peter de Grote and Paul Gérard, editors-in-chief of the TED and L'Echo. Gentlemen, welcome. Peter, we are surrounded by these young Belgian entrepreneurs. Why is that?
Well, it's actually pretty obvious to us. The TED has always had this strong entrepreneurial spirit. The people in this audience are the people we are writing for every day. We want to bring them the news, but we also want to inspire them. With events like this, New Insights event.
Yeah, Paul, I can imagine that it's also the same for L'Echo.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, this new generation of entrepreneurs is a source of inspiration for us as well. They are true innovators. They set the scene in Belgium and far beyond. They are building a new economy, a more sustainable, a more innovative economy. Yeah. In fact, they have, and we noticed that they have a real eye for society.
Yeah. It sounds also, Peter, that there's no coincidence that you invited Professor Mazzucato to talk about a socially responsible and sustainable economy, right?
No, it's absolutely no coincidence. She already wrote and taught a lot about it, of course, but we want to particularly hear from her about how this relaunch of this economy post-pandemic can happen in a responsible and durable way, things she has great expertise about.
Yeah, and she's not the first international opinion leader to participate in New Insights. Who else did you have as a keynote speaker in the past?
We had Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, Chris Anderson, famous for his maker movement, Paul Krugman, who won a Nobel Prize, and Raghuram Rajan, who is now the governor of the National Bank of India.
Okay, that's an impressive list, I have to say. How did you manage to get them on board?
Well, it's all about being connected with
Yes.
with the right people at the right moment. And you know, when you propose to someone, I have a vision for you. Do you want to share your vision with us?
Yeah.
They say yes, we come.
And what is that vision?
The vision is clear. We want to inform and, at the same time, to inspire people in business and finance with new insights from all over the world, from true leaders, from thought leaders, from pioneers, from influencers, from people, in fact, who share a unique view on economy, on society, on doing business.
Yeah, and Peter, did COVID make it easier or harder to find a keynote speaker this year?
I don't think it made that big of a difference. We build a solid reputation, so we have kind of a name in the industry. And when COVID makes things challenging for us to do a live event, we do it with a beautiful hybrid event like this one.
Yeah, and it is beautiful indeed. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Peter and Paul, we'll be hearing from you later again.
Why don't you cry for me? Don't you cry for me this time? Baby, don't you try to be just anyone you like and let it out, let it out. You gotta let it out.
We heard Peter and Paul talking with great admiration about our young entrepreneurs. Now it's time that we meet a few of them. Welcome, Emna and Gauthier. Emna, you're the founder and the CEO of Casidomi. What does Casidomi exactly do?
So, Casidomi is an e-commerce, an international e-commerce that sells healthy and eco-friendly products. And we are on a mission to accelerate the transition towards better ways of consumption, not only for the health, but also for the planet.
Is that the reason why you started the company?
That's the reason why, exactly. But it's also, the story is a bit old because my father is a doctor specialized in nutrition. And I've always been really passionate about food and what I consume. And I wanted to actually set the example of another way of consumption that really highlights and that encourages consumption that is, I'll say, more into prevention, more focused on health benefits, natural products, less transformed goods as well, and also, of course, better for the environment.
Yeah, it sounds fabulous. How do you approach this?
How do I approach this? We try to work and we want to work with producers directly and not through suppliers or distributors in order to make it affordable to consumers. And by doing so, we're really able to propose them good prices, but we are also able to remunerate producers at a fair price, which is not always the case, of course. And secondly, what we do is that we work with producers who are close from the ingredients geographically, which means that we're able to propose very high quality products, which is respecting actually the culture and the tradition of the producers.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Nat Gauthier. You own Perlego. What is exactly Perlego?
So Perlego has been kind of branded as the Spotify for textbooks, very similar to Emna. We're also on a mission. We're on a mission to make educational content more affordable. To date, we've got over 600,000 titles, work with over 3,500 publishers. Yeah, that's pretty much what we are.
And where the idea came from?
So it came out of a personal pain point of mine, which were expensive prices of textbooks. So as an interesting stat, textbook prices have actually gone through the roof, more than 847% since 1982, or 3 times the rate of inflation. So it was a problem I was seeing myself. I was using a subscription product for my music, for my movies, and I thought, surely a subscription service for academic content should also exist.
So how do you make this work exactly?
So we do direct distribution deals with publishers. We give them 65% of revenue, and then we've built a consumer brand where students can pay either 12 euros or 96 euros for full access to all their contents.
So your business philosophy is very much in line with our keynote speaker, with Professor Mazzucato's idea of a socially responsible and sustainable economy. Emna, how do you feel about her proposal to give the government a bigger say in the economy?
I kind of have a mixed feeling about it. On the one hand, I think that the government plays a big role in increasing and boosting innovation, but also solving big issues such as global warming, which is great, but I really think that the government could and should do much more for the environment. And on the other hand, I think that today, unfortunately, there are many companies that are taking advantage of all those measures and that are not really at the sake of the environment or innovation, but for tax reduction or subsidies, which is, I think, not really, it's a bit of an injustice.
Yes, and what are your thoughts, Gauthier?
I think I'd have to agree to all of Imna's points, but I do think, nowadays generation expects sustainable products, and I do think there's a role of government to drive sustainability more in the economy. So I think it's potentially a good thing.
Thank you very much. One last question. Do you like cycling?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, we love it. I'm a massive fan.
All right, but I love cycling, and although doing an interview while riding a bike can be quite of a challenge.
Hi Patrick, what a nice day.
It's lovely. I wouldn't have expected that.
So, how are you today?
Couldn't be better.
With this weather, let's go for a ride?
Let's go.
Let's go. So Patrick, our next speaker is Mariana Mazzucato. I hardly dare to say it, but I don't know her.
Well, to be honest, for the grand public, she's not so famous. But amongst economists, she's a real superstar.
And why is that?
First of all, she got tremendous ideas. She's got Italian flair, American efficiency, and amongst others, she's also got a great sense of humor.
So she's Italian.
She's definitely Italian. Actually, she was born in Rome. She grew up in the northeast coast in the US, and then she actually studied in London. And after that, she got married, got 4 children, and still is living in London.
A woman of the world.
She's definitely a woman of the world. She actually meets up, I'm not going to say on a daily basis, but quite frequently with world leaders to actually advise them.
So I understand that she's an economic celebrity.
Well, she actually is a challenger of the normal economists today, and she actually hasn't got any holy grail. And the most funny thing about her is the fact that she's also appreciated by the Pope.
My God, Patrick, if I wouldn't be on a bike, I would be on the edge of my seat right now.
Well, there's even more.
Oh, what else?
Well, I can put it in one word, and that's moon landing.
So does she want to go to the moon herself?
Well, you should definitely ask that herself, but she definitely says that we got to go to the moon again.
And what does that have to do with economy?
Our theory actually is that every moon landing gives us an enormous economic boost.
Wasn't it the state that funded and launched that spaceship? It was not a private funded enterprise, right?
That's actually the full point that she's making. When you look currently at companies like Tesla or Google, they're actually usually state-funded, although as a private mark they're really rock stars, and no one actually considers it to be state-able.
So she thinks that we should appreciate the state more for its economic support.
That's her whole point. She actually wants the state to play a bigger role. Speaking in bike terms, actually what she wants is that the state or a government gets on the bike and gets more involved into the economic race.
Well, Patrick, I really start to understand why she's the Beyoncé of economy. I suggest that we give her the stage and we'll continue with our bike ride.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our keynote speaker. And don't forget, you can ask her your question with the Q&A box. Via the Q&A box, we will raise them during her fireside chat later on. We welcome Professor Mazzucato. Good evening. Welcome, Mariana. How are you tonight?
Good evening. I'm fine. Thank you so much. It's boiling in London.
It's boiling in London.
Yeah. It is. It's actually close to 30 degrees.
Oh,
We're
wow.
not used to it. So
It's pretty
everyone's
nice.
naked outside.
Oh, that's really crucial information for tonight. How do you feel about this title, the Beyonce of economy?
I liked it. What I didn't like, I'm going to start to be provocative from the beginning, is the notion of bigger government. I think we need better, much better, more strategic, more creative, more dynamic government,
All
not
right.
bigger.
Thank you very much for this insight. Well, I think you have a lot more to say. How do you feel about this keynote presentation that you will give now?
I'm very excited about it, especially because I've just heard 15 minutes of really interesting and inspirational comments by your young entrepreneurs, and also, the bike rider. I missed his name, but very, very interesting what he was saying. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mariana. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I hope you can see my screen. I've shared it. So really, just as I was saying, what I want to do is really debunk this notion of, do we need more state, less state? Who are the entrepreneurs? Are they just the youth, these wonderful, beautiful people I just saw? Or do we actually need to rethink the entrepreneurial system, the ecosystem? And in order to do that, really rethink everything, rethink business, rethink government, rethink public-private partnerships. Because really, we need to remember that the economy is an outcome of how we govern all the different value-creating institutions, whether they are in the state, in business, whether they are in nonprofits, whether those businesses are small, medium, or large. But the intra-organizational governance questions really, really matter, and especially the relationships between all these different actors. So, when we talk about building back better, which everyone is saying now, especially, President Biden, that's his slogan. Whether we talk about building forwards, not just back, much, much better, we have to really ask ourselves, how do we do that? How can we learn from the mistakes that we seem to continue to make time and time again? In fact, we keep going from crisis to crisis to crisis, whether it's an economic crisis, whether it's a climate crisis, whether it's a health crisis. We are just so badly prepared. And I think the COVID-19 moment has really woken us up. You were just talking about going to the moon. Well, that's much, much harder than producing personal protection equipment for frontline workers. And in so many countries, even advanced industrialized countries, we do not provide that equipment for the frontline workers. We call them essential workers, but don't actually know how to value their work. We don't pay them enough. The social infrastructure within which they work is not currently as good as it can be. And then the vaccine, yes, we have the vaccine, but if then 80% of the world doesn't have access to it because it's being hoarded by the other 10 to 20%, that's no good. And if we continue to have intellectual property rights, which really privatize knowledge and don't allow what we really need right now, which is collective intelligence and massive sharing, that's no good either. And then we can also look at the digital divide. As I mentioned, I have 4 children. They've been in lockdown for a large part of this and last year. And of course, they continue to have access to their human right to education because of the social and economic, background of their family. But so many children in both developed and developing countries stopped having access to their human right to education during the lockdown because we haven't solved that digital divide problem. So, it's a huge, huge wake-up moment, and also a moment that is starving for innovation, is starving for entrepreneurship, is starving for new solutions to old and new problems, and getting as many different actors together to solve these problems is important. However, if we don't have the right system, the ecosystem, the innovation system, the partnerships, it's not going to happen. And it's not happening around climate change. When was it? About 2 years ago, the IPCC report came out in 2019 and said we only had 10 years left, basically, to solve global warming. And, we have less than 10 years now, and yet we're not moving as fast as Greta Thunberg told us to move when she was 16. You'll remember she said, if your house is on fire, what do? Do you just sit there and say, what should I do? Pros and cons. You get the hell out. We're not getting out of this mess. In fact, in just the same year that the IPCC report came out, we spent $55 billion worth in subsidies to fossil fuel companies in the European Union. And even during the COVID-19 recovery, we continue to fund companies that are based on fossil fuels through government handouts, subsidies, and bailouts. So, this is not about more government, bigger government. This is about really thinking, what kind of business, what kind of government, what kind of relationships do we need, and what kind of time frame do we need to solve these problems? And one of the things I've been arguing for quite a long time is that we have not only problems within the business sector, which I actually wrote about quite a bit in my previous book called The Value of Everything, in terms of, businesses just worry too much about making short-term profits, worried about increasing their stock price. So, something like $4 trillion have been spent in the last decade by businesses just on buying back their shares instead of reinvesting that money into the economy to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. So that's a whole governance problem that is often talked about, the need to move away from shareholder maximization towards stakeholder value, stakeholder creation and maximization of all the different relationships. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end. But what I want to argue here, and what I have been arguing, but I feel like I have to continue because unfortunately we're not seeing enough change, is that governments also have to rethink how they are governed. They unfortunately have bought into this idea that economists have trained them to think, which is that government is there to fix market failures. You actually have to wait for markets to fail in order to do anything, or think they will fail in order to do anything. So you're always in that mode of bandaging things up, of filling the gap of something that the private sector is not doing. And so, if the private sector is not spending enough on basic research and development, government's gonna do it. If the private sector is creating too much pollution, government has to come in and create a carbon tax of some sort. If private banks are not lending enough to small, medium enterprises, then government should come in and do that. And it's not that these market failures don't exist. It's that if you are literally always in bandaging mode, you will always be too little, too late. So the real enemy is not so much Reagan or Thatcher, who said, government, get out of the way. That was a very clear message, and it's a very easy message to, basically call out as being not very smart. The real enemy, I think, is this idea that government at best is there to fix problems. And what I really deeply believe is that we need a different framework. We need co-creation and co-shaping of markets between business, government, and other actors. And market failure theory has gotten us the wrong kind of governments. And it's not a surprise that those same governments that have just bought into this end up actually outsourcing so much of their brain to the consulting companies. You know who I'm talking about. KPMG, Ernst & Young, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, and so on and so forth. And it was really interesting, again, during COVID-19, that a Tory lord, so a conservative lord in the UK government, called this out, saying that he was looking at the numbers and how much the government was outsourcing both the management of Brexit and of COVID-19, he thought was infantilizing the state. And I've started to use that word because it's not, again, about bigger government. It's more strategic. It's more long-term, more mission-oriented, purpose-driven, adult government. It's not, just kind of government there in the sidelines, cheerleading, and actually when it does things, it perhaps doesn't have the capacity, and it's not a surprise because it hasn't invested within its own structures. So what I did recently in my new book called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism, was to say, come on, we can do so much better. And we have to do so much better. We have to do so much better because, first of all, in each of these crises I've mentioned, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, and the health crisis, we are simply not getting out of these problems. We are just, again, patching them up. But also because you'll remember that in 2015, every single country, Belgium, Holland, Congo, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, the United Kingdom, we all signed up to 17 goals, 17 really broad challenges that are called the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are not solving those challenges. There's 169 targets underneath them, starving for entrepreneurship, starving for creativity and dynamism, and we're simply not getting there. So what I did in the book is I said, look, let's just go back 50 years and ask ourselves, how did we get to the moon? You know, that was hard. That was really hard, because they also had to come back. The mission was not just to go, it was to come back, and also to do it within a relatively short period. Kennedy announced that he wanted it to be done within a decade, within a generation, he said. And, you know, his goal was really to beat the Russians. It was the Sputnik moment. It was the Cold War period. But if you read the speech, and these were different speeches he gave at Rice Stadium, he also gave one to the Irish Parliament, and so on, he often said, we need to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. Because it's a really clear goal, but so many great things are going to come from that in terms of what we would call in economics dynamic spillovers across the way. He said, you know, we're going to fail probably along the way, which you'll know they did fail along the way in the Apollo 1 tragic fire where 3 astronauts lost their lives. But he said it's worth it. We need to experiment. We need to do learning by doing. It will cost money, but it's going to be worth it. And what was really interesting was that they had no idea, literally no idea how to get to the moon and back at the time of his speech in the early 60s. And they finally settled on a particular way, the lunar orbit rendezvous, which was just one of 3 or 4 different ways that they were considering. But that kind of willingness to experiment and to be clear that it was going to be hard, that actually it was being done because it was hard, but it was worth it. It was an inspirational mission which would require so many different actors across the economy. In fact, it wasn't just aerospace. It was, you know, investments in nutrition, in materials, in electronics, and software. But what was so interesting also was that when NASA decided to, you know, do this crazy thing of going to the moon and back without having a clue, they realized very early on that they had to change. They had to change their own organization. You'll know that governments are often accused of being bureaucratic, of working in silos, of being slow, too much red tape, on, so forth. And after, actually, during the Apollo 1 simulation program, just before the fire, one of the 3 astronauts who tragically died, Gus Grissom, he couldn't hear, just like I've got these earphones on, he couldn't hear what was being said to him from the mission control room. And at one point he was like, Jesus Christ, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because there was all these silos and the ways that different parts of NASA were failing also then to communicate and to work together in a horizontal, dynamic kind of feedback way that really welcomed the kind of complexity that that moonshot required. So this graph here that you see, this, a figure, is something that George Mueller, who came from Bell Labs, drew, where he said, look, we need to be much more horizontal. We need, you know, program managers who have teams, but these program managers in different departments need constant horizontal communication. Otherwise, you know, we will fail to communicate. We will fail to be as dynamic, agile, and flexible as we need to be if we're going to accomplish this mission in a decade. And what then happened was just so interesting. By engaging so many different sectors, again, it was not just the state, lots of private sector innovation. It was not just aeronautics. It was all sorts of sectors, including what later became the software industry as we know it today. You know, all those spillovers along the way, finding different types of solutions to the 5,000 or whatever homework problems that needed to be done are what got us pretty, you know, earthly goods like camera phones, athletic shoes, home insulation, foil blankets, baby formula, and so forth. And you know, this is a really important point because I'm sure we'll speak during the Q&A of kind of modern day missions, and these are mainly social missions. Not only should we achieve them, but we need to be setting up our structures to produce these spillovers, to really foster a real dynamic relationship between science and industry and different types of businesses that really then can welcome this kind of serendipity, right? Where the search for one thing leads to the discovery of something else. Everyone will remember that Viagra itself was not meant to do what it does today. It was meant to be for the heart. And then something else popped up. Well, that's very, very common. Everyone should be laughing now. If you haven't understood the joke. And also what was so interesting was that NASA actually partnered with the private sector with purpose. You know, all this discussion today by B Corps or the kind of notion of stakeholder value in places like Davos about that we need purpose. Well, what was interesting is that NASA put that purpose at the center of the relationship between business and itself. So they talked about, yes, let's partner, but you can't earn excess profits. Of course you should earn profits. It's not a charity. We're not doing this as philanthropy, but not in excess of what you're actually doing because it's a partnership. They also redesigned their procurement contracts to be not cost plus, which was just elevating and inflating government costs, but fixed price contracts that ran like prize schemes, but with constant incentives for innovation and quality improvement. So you'd get an extra share if you made that kind of radical innovation along the way. And they also were very aware that they had to be smart. They couldn't outsource their brain as governments are doing today. They realized that without their own capabilities, this is a quote from Ernest Brackett, they would be captured by what he called brochuremanship. And Ernest was the head of procurement for NASA. And at the time, businesses didn't have PowerPoints. They had brochures. And he said, if we're not smart ourselves, we won't know who to partner with. We won't even know how to write the terms of reference. So, it also did cost a lot of money, as Kennedy said it would. He was clear to say that it was going to cost less than what we spend every year on cigarettes and cigars. But really, we shouldn't just look at the funds that were spent, even though they were a lot in terms of how we would look today at government budgets spent on missions. But what mattered was that the multiplier across the economy, the kind of net effect also in GDP, which is what Keynes talks about, right? The effect on output for every government euro, pound, or dollar was quite high, precisely because it galvanized and catalyzed and crowded in so much private sector innovation and investment. And over 400,000 people apparently were actually being employed in one way or another across both business and government. And so, for the moon landing. And so what I argue in the book, and what I'll say in my last 4 minutes, is that, we have to be equally ambitious today on the Earth shots. And I've already mentioned them, the 17 goals, not because I think they're important. I do think they're important, but every government has signed up to them. So what does it mean to put your signature on a set of 17 goals? We have to treat it with the same level of urgency, of seriousness, of innovation, of science-industry linkages, of public-private partnerships, and making sure that those partnerships are actually symbiotic and not parasitic, that they're mutualistic and not predator-prey. And the reason I'm using those harsh words is, I do actually think we have the wrong kind of partnership in many sectors, like the health industry, where you have, like in the United States, $40 billion a year being spent by the government on health innovation, and then the prices of the drugs don't reflect that, or the intellectual property rights, how they're structured, don't reflect that. So what does it mean to create a partnership around purpose? And this is why I've been talking for quite a while about missions. And this report here that you see on the screen was not a book. It was a report I wrote for the European Commission, on the back of which missions are now actually a legal instrument used in the Horizon Innovation Program in Europe, but also we've been through my institute that I run in University College London, called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. We've been trying to help different countries think about what this means also for their industrial strategy. And what it means is you start with the big challenge, right? The Kennedy challenge was beat the Russians, Sputnik, but today the challenges are the SDGs. We have to turn each and every one of them into several types of missions, like, the clean ocean one, SDG 14, must become, a plastic-free ocean. And what does that mean in terms of actually doing that with a particular target, a particular period of time, in terms of all the different sectors? It's not going to be one sector. Many different sectors, just like the moon landing, will have to get involved. And what's really then crucial are these circles you see there on the bottom. What does this mean for the way that government has to, in a serious way, redesign and apply design thinking to procurement contracts, as Ernest Brackett did, to grants, loans, subsidies, bailouts, recovery funds, if we're talking about COVID-19. So again, starting with those, bold challenges, turning them into moonshots, cross-sectoral and bottom-up experimentation within the business community, small, medium, and large. And if you are a small business and getting involved in these earth shots, you'll need extra support. But the reason you should get support is not because you're small, because I don't like to fetishize size, at least for this. If you're small, you will need extra support if you're willing to engage in all sorts of different, a challenge and purpose-oriented goals. And so picking the willing, not picking the winners, is what I tell governments. And one of the things we did is we worked with the UK's industrial strategy and said, stop just thinking about sectors. Think about big problems. They chose these. You'll see here clean growth, future of mobility, and aging, and turn these into different types of missions, like the future of mobility one. We helped them think through what did that mean for actually even increasing, for example, the ways that disabled people access the public transportation system. But that had to be designed into the mission itself of making sure we had a 100% accessible public transport system. In Sweden, they've started to do really interesting things with missions, bringing them into schools, having missions around school meals, healthy, tasty, sustainable school meals, getting school children involved in co-creating them. We've worked with Manchester. I don't have time, so I won't go through that. I'll just say one thing that we're doing in Camden, a part of London, which is also looking at particular institutions like youth centers and saying, what would it mean to transform those institutions, public libraries, youth centers, community centers, into the best that the 21st century can offer in order to tackle knife crime, in order to tackle the digital divide. But again, that really requires first setting that really bold mission. So Camden did it by saying by 2025, every young person in Camden has to have access to economic opportunity that enables them to be safe and secure. And this was also because of the increasing youth violence that we have here. Let me just skip ahead. This is my last slide, or one of the last ones, so I promise 20 seconds left. And I just want to come back to this point of B Corps and purpose-oriented, challenge-oriented businesses. I really think this is the moment to walk that talk. You know, climate change, the COVID moment. What does it actually mean to bring purpose to the center of the system, not just to corporate governance, as Larry Fink or the Business Roundtable talk about often with ESGs, at the center of how we actually do capitalism. And this means we need to govern the system differently. As AOC says, we need to govern health innovation in such a way that actually puts public value and citizen well-being at the center, instead of just flooding the system with public money towards drugs and then getting wrong the governance. So again, bringing public value at the center of health innovation, but also with COVID-19, when you have trillions being poured into the system, what does it mean to actually include conditionalities in terms of how you access recovery? Committing to reducing carbon emissions, as the French finance minister here forced Renault and Air France to do. Or in Austria and Denmark, they said, if you use tax havens, sorry, you're not going to get some recovery funds. So this conditionality, I think, is really important to think of a new social contract. We also need new institutions. I was on a call yesterday with the mayor of Barcelona. She's actually hired hackers into the city government. Sorry, I'm trying to unshare here. Otherwise, I'm going to talk forever. There we go. In order precisely to get the city itself to be able to think much more strategically about the data commons, right? So it's not just about having mission-oriented policies, we need mission-oriented organizations. And I'll just stop there just to say that I really hope your community of entrepreneurs there rethinks government, not as this big blob that often gets in the way, or at best needs a bit more money to put into the innovation system, but a government that we should be holding accountable to actually doing its job, to helping us solve the challenges we have, and the need for itself to be entrepreneurial in order to catalyze a dynamic public-private partnership instead of the inertial ones that we have today. So thank you very much. Oh, and I know you have a wonderful band, so let's hear the band now to have a bit of a break from my rant.
Why don't we take a ride, us together? Don't worry about tonight or what shoes you left to wear. Black mirrors or black windows, they all show the same. Put rumors on the stereo. I'll be you, I'll be free, I'll be anyone you want me to be. Like a fuse, hit the streets, let's move our bodies to the beat. It's all we are, more of time, before we turn, won't slow down. It's all we are, more of time, till we collide in sacred night.
Thank you very much, Compact Disc Dummies, and thank you, Mariana, for these great insights. Now it's time to hand it over to Isabelle Albers for her fireside chats. I'm sure she has been listening very carefully to everything Mariana had to say. Right, Isabelle?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Emily. Good evening, Professor. Since our time is limited, let's dive straight into the heart of the matter. Maybe you won't like the first question. I will ask it anyway. You want governments to take the driving seat in the economy, and you say we have to rethink value creation as a collective endeavor and a purpose-driven economy, but planned by the state. It might sound a bit like communism. And some of your criticists say, well, Professor Mazzucato is just an ideologist calling for a big active state, because running the economy is not the same. It's not like getting a man on the moon and back. What do you say about that?
So first of all, I understand why people say that, because there's a lot of disillusion with the kind of governments we have. And so I think my work is often misunderstood as defending the government. I'm doing the opposite. I'm saying we don't have the governments we need, but we also don't have the private sector companies we need often, and we don't have the right relationships. So, you know, it's not me saying that government should be doing things. We have, I keep coming back to the SDGs because I'm very serious about them. We have signed up to them. That means we need to tilt the playing field towards the kinds of companies that are willing to go in that direction, to invest, to innovate in that direction. Yeah. And so it's not that government should direct everything. That kills innovation. If you micromanage the system, it kills innovation. That's why I'm very careful to look at case studies of where it worked and where it didn't work. And what NASA did at the time, I don't actually think it's doing it right now in a very ambitious way. It cared to bring in as much private sector innovation as possible. It wasn't directing the show. It really was actually catalyzing the kind of innovation by providing those early stage investments, but then they crowded in, you know, hundreds of different types of companies and lots of that serendipity that I talked about, those spillovers that happen along the way. That's really my biggest argument, that in order to drive innovation-led growth, in order to have entrepreneurial systems, we need much more ambitious government that thinks about the goals we have, but then structures the tools on the ground to crowd in as much private sector investment as possible. And we're not doing that right now. Yeah. So unfortunately, there's lots of ideology. And I would throw the question back to the questioner. Give up the ideology, please. Let's get over the big state, bad state, and let's get the right relationship and the right structures.
Okay, so it works both ways, you say. But when working in such a collective model, what about the risk that one might kill the entrepreneurial spirit, which has brought us marvelous things?
I mean, it's funny. Okay, so can I just, again, be a bit provocative? I don't know if you're doing it on purpose or not, but it's like I say something and then people are like a wall and they just repeat back, you know, what is being said as though they didn't hear the presentation. So I'm saying we need entrepreneurship, but we need to put entrepreneurship at the center of the system. It's a myth that entrepreneurship is just inside business. Everything that makes our iPhones or smartphones smart and not stupid were funded actually by government. So internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. But that wasn't enough. You needed private sector companies like Apple to do great things with the internet, with GPS. And the wonderful sense of design and simplicity inside Apple was incredibly useful. But it doesn't make sense to say Apple does everything, the state is rubbish, or the state should do everything and Apple is rubbish. So it's really about how do we actually learn what can give us innovation-led, entrepreneurial-led growth. And that's not the kind of growth we currently have. In the UK, where I'm standing today, boiling, by the way, because it's 30 degrees, we have consumption-led growth. That consumption is fed by private debt. So our ratio of private debt, not public debt, private debt to disposable income is back at the level it was before the financial crisis. So to transform our systems from consumption-led to investment-led growth, for that investment to be full of innovation by public and private actors and to direct that innovation towards solving big goals, but not then micromanage a system, but actually just make it goal-oriented and transforming the instruments to bring in as many entrepreneurs along the way, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. And if one just talks about entrepreneurship, if one just brings in venture capital or talks about wealth creators and, you know, sets up different types of startups, nothing happens unless it's an entrepreneurial system, unless we actually have entrepreneurship funding, for example, patient long-term funding. Like in Israel, they had Yozma, which was a big public fund for entrepreneurs, and that really required, again, public and private to meet, both in the financing, but also in the science industry linkages.
Okay, I did listen carefully, and you said,
I know.
and you said, I don't want bigger governments, I want better governments. You said, but if you look at Belgium, for example, we are 11 million people and 6 governments, 7 parliaments, then you've got the European level, we've got local authorities, and even all those entrepreneurs, especially the young ones, who really share that purpose of sustainability and who really want to work together with governments. Well, it is so complicated, it is so slow to work together with governments. How can we improve the performance of our governments then?
So it's such an important question. And by the way, I was trying to be provocative before. I didn't mean to. I know you were listening. So, you know, that's the question. And that's why in the book, but also in my previous book, The Entrepreneurial State, I looked at particular types of government institutions that have been very useful, actually, to get us not only innovation, but to get those public-private partnerships I've been talking about. So DARPA in the United States, which was the public entity in the Department of Defense that invested in the internet, what's interesting is how DARPA is set up. It brings people in for 5 years, actually rewards them as they become civil servants inside DARPA to take risks. They are actually evaluated by how much risk they're willing to take. And they have portfolios of investments. They don't put all their eggs in one basket and obsess about one technology. They're very solution driven and the technology follows. And so, you know, I'm from Italy, so I'm the first to know that government can be big, bureaucratic, full of red tape, slow, and more of an impediment than a solution, hence the reason to rethink government. But what was also so interesting in Italy, and I know this is also the case in Spain when I was speaking yesterday to the Barcelona mayor, is that it actually took a crisis like COVID-19 to get Italy to innovate around its procurement policy, because they had to produce PPE, personal protection equipment, which up until COVID was all being produced in China. So they had to do what the US has often done during war with the Defense Production Procurement Act, which after the Korean War was devised in order to quickly transform manufacturing into wartime industry. And, you know, we shouldn't do this, though, just with a crisis, just with a war, just with a pandemic. That should be the way that we structure procurement always, in order to actually procure in innovative solutions from small, medium enterprises, in order to solve big goals like the digital divide question that I talked about before, like the plastic-free ocean question, like the carbon-neutral cities, you know, issue, or the Camden projects of getting, or in Sweden, you know, sustainable, healthy, tasty school meals. What does it mean to redesign procurement? So it really is solution-driven, almost like a prize scheme, right? And bringing in as many different types of companies as possible to fulfill those goals, but with a strong direction from government. So you're not just commercializing a sector because it's good in and of itself to bring in business. You're bringing in business because you know you need help and you need to collaborate together, fostering collective intelligence. And that requires a very different type of government, which in the new book I go through kind of almost in too much detail. It's almost like a recipe of what does it mean for grants, loans, procurement, but also intra-organizational culture in that way that George Mueller talked about after that Apollo 1 fire.
Okay, thank you. Talking about sustainability, even this last week, we see how changes in the air. I don't know if you saw it, but last week there was a judge in the Netherlands who fined Shell for not doing enough against climate change. And climate activists are now on the board at ExxonMobil. So it is just two topics in our newspapers from the last week. We see that changes in the air, but will it be fast enough? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about that really emergency fight against climate change?
I'm optimistic in the potential. I mean, for exactly the reasons you say, that we have, it's no longer accepted that businesses are just doing nothing, and you get that kind of activism also in terms of the investment boards. But I think what's really important is that we standardize and normalize the kind of ESG kind of metrics inside business, which continue to almost just be, well, not standardized, not global, not mandatory. So if we, take all three of those letters, not just the E, but also the S, which means also working conditions, it means the kind of different types of governance issues that I was also talking about with health innovation. If we start to normalize what that actually means, make it mandatory, global, easily understood and transparent, then we're really going to see change. But until we have that, we're going to have some interesting examples here and there, but it's not actually going to create system change. And what climate change requires is massive transformative change of every part of the economy. It's not just about renewable energy, getting Exxon to stop doing fossils. It's about changing how we create cement, how we create steel, how we nourish our children, what we do literally from the moment we wake up to when we go to bed. That was that quick slide I skipped through in Manchester, where we worked with Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, to create missions that had to do with citizens and their lives from literally the morning to the evening, with citizens at the table thinking about what does sustainable living mean, instead of it being top down, professed by academics or businesses or political parties. What does it mean to bring citizen assemblies or people living in housing estates in Camden to the table to actually set these missions in the first place? Because they're living in the very communities or housing estates that are supposed to go green. If we don't have new voices at the table, then first of all, it's not going to excite or inspire. And we shouldn't forget the janitor in NASA, when he was asked, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm also putting a man on the moon, thank you very much." We need that kind of citizen inspiration. But also, I think we need to remember we are living through one of the most polarized political moments, in the UK with Brexit, in the US with Trump, in Europe with so many people no longer believing in the European project. So we need as much social innovation in terms of how we bring democratic participation to these processes as we need technological and organizational.
Okay, thank you. Lots and lots of work, Professor. But I'm not the only one asking questions. Let's have a look at what our audience wants to know from Professor Mazzucato. Emily.
Well, yes, indeed, there are a lot of questions from our audience. Some of our guests have some questions for Mariana. Aline, tell us what you want to know.
Hello. I personally work on SDG 16, which is on ensuring participatory democracy. So to pick in on what you just explained, what do you see as the role or the structural role of involving citizens in the way we do government and in how we shape economic public policies?
Great question. I mean, there's so many different important sort of bits of the answer that one should come up with to that question. One is, participation, as I was talking about through the example of citizen assemblies, which is the mission setting itself has to be thought about together. That example I gave in Sweden of the school meals, getting school children and students involved, in both tasting the meals to make sure they actually are good, not just sustainable, not just carbon free in the value chain, but actually thinking about and learning about the meals through the curriculum, but also literally setting the agenda around the school meals. I think that process is incredibly important, and it's also very enriching, and it also makes the missions last longer than just, say, the minister who thought it up, perhaps in the first place. But also, I personally don't think we actually have enough innovation, as I was just mentioning, around things like citizen assemblies. I mean, if you look at the cooperative movement, for example, in Spain, where you have Mondragon, a very large cooperative with 87,000 workers in it, that itself is engagement, right? That means worker engagement, not just through trade unions, but through the corporate governance structure. So that itself, again, I think needs a lot of innovation, social innovation through mutualistic forms of corporate governance. But also, if we think of the social movements recently, Fridays for the Future, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, we should remember that some of the biggest innovations of our time came through social movements. The weekend, the 8-hour workday, we wouldn't have them without the labor movement. So what does it mean also for governments to allow themselves to be vulnerable and open themselves up and to have empathy? By empathy, I don't mean sympathy. Empathy meaning you literally put yourself in other people's shoes and listen in a non-tokenistic way to what these movements are fighting for. Again, Fridays for the Future, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and all the different social and economic issues behind those in order to improve the kind of capitalism we have. Because there's many ways of doing capitalism. And I think in many countries we have the wrong form of capitalism. And we should remember that capitalism itself has, over the last 200 years of its history, it's more or less 300 years old, evolved over time because certain people were fighting to make it better. Like those examples I gave. Again, children would still be working in factories had there not been movements improving the way that we produce. And that's all part of how markets function. So we should not think of it as like the market is here and then the citizen is there. The market itself evolves depending on how much we allow citizens and social movements to impact it. And that's why, also coming back to that example of what just happened in Exxon, why it's so interesting is that these are social struggles, which over time, I think, do improve our system.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mariana. We have one final question from the audience, from Jonathan. Jonathan, what would you like to know?
Thank you, Mariana. Great speech. In this data-driven digital economy, in post-pandemic, even more digital than before, AI and AI models will become huge profit generators. And one of the key topics in your thought framework is value creators, identifying value creators. Now, because it's all digital, we can, in AI model creation, much more easily identify the value creators. And sometimes the citizen is also a value creator. Can the coin economy and blockchain technology lead to a more just society by connecting, by identifying the value creators in a much more just way, so profit can be more equally partitioned of this AI model generation? And what are the caveats?
That's a great question. You know, I mean, one of the powers of blockchain is exactly what you just said, which is to reduce the intermediation, right? So to have a much more direct relationship with actually value creation and also its distribution. So on the one hand, I think you're right. That could potentially allow us also to account for value in a much kind of more transparent way. And ideally, that would also have a macroeconomic impact, because I've been arguing for some time that that GDP includes lots of rent. That we're confusing profits with rents, and rent is often accumulated precisely through these intermediary kind of fee-setting exercises that ideally blockchain could help actually get rid of. But on the other hand, in terms of the caveats that you talked about, I think in the end, it's not just about kind of individuals like, oh, who created value. It is very much also about setting up some sort of commons, right? I mean, data today, and I know I'm not the only one saying this, should actually almost be seen as a human right. As we create data and the data about us and our privacy and all sorts of different things that Shoshana Zuboff talks about in Surveillance Capitalism, a wonderful book, we need to be setting up collective structures to also house that data and to govern it in such a way, not just by the state, but think of it governing it almost like Wikipedia and CERN and the UN kind of all in one. And we have a project, by the way, I'd be happy to share with you if you want to reach out to me, funded by the Meteor Foundation, actually trying to plot out algorithmic rents. So if you look at Google and Amazon and how they've used algorithms over the last years, they fundamentally changed. In the beginning, these algorithms were really creating a lot of value, not just for consumers, but also for the whole supply chain, but especially around the supply chain. In very recent years, a lot of the suppliers, in both Google and Amazon, in terms of those, on their search engines, are no longer actually benefiting as much. And, the kind of very large monopoly power that these companies have because of the network externalities is increasingly being used in some ways to extract value, not to create it, in terms of ad revenue and marketing revenue. So what you're seeing on the web is what they want you to see on the web. Shoshana says, you think you're searching Google for free. Well, Google's actually searching you for free. And so kind of reversing that and bringing back that strong kind of value creation side of the algorithms itself, I think requires much more than blockchain. It actually requires really to govern the ecosystem in a fundamentally different way. And given that the technology behind the algorithms continues mainly to be government funded, it's not just big companies like Google, I think the government has the duty to make sure that these are being governed in a way towards the common interest and the common good and not just private profit.
We also received a number of great questions from our viewers at home. Unfortunately, we only have time to answer one question. Paul, which question did you select for Mariana?
Yes, we got a lot of very interesting questions, Peter. We had to choose one among them. And this one. Isn't the problem that there are too many SDGs as opposed to the clear message, get to the moon?
So the SDG is not a mission. These are challenges. So remember the example with the moon landing and getting to the moon and back again in one generation. That was the mission. The challenge was beat the Russians, Sputnik, the Cold War challenge. So the SDGs are the challenges. Each and every one of them can have different types of moonshots. So I gave as an example, I probably went through it too quickly, but the climate change one, I talked about carbon neutral cities, the clean oceans one, which is very broad, getting a plastic-free ocean within the next 5 years, getting 90% of the plastic out. These are kind of the missions, but it's not me that should, or even you, or anyone who should come up with the missions. It really does require that kind of engagement through our industrial strategies, innovation policies, citizen engagement, city mayors. That's why I was speaking yesterday to some mayors, should be on the front lines with citizens thinking about local city level missions, regional missions, national missions, or international missions, like the plastic-free one is not going to happen with just one country doing it because water flows.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. One very last question, since you're boiling in London and sun is shining over Brussels, but terraces are reopening and people are so happy to meet again. And in Europe, we expect a quarter of 15% growth. Are we at the beginning of the roaring 20s, or is it too optimistic?
Well, we should be careful because sometimes out of exuberance, we're just going to think growth for growth's sake because everything's been in lockdown. We want the restaurants to earn money and so on. So as long as that growth is directed to be more inclusive, more sustainable, and to use these different moonshots to guide it, then I'm, happy. If it's just going to be growth for growth's sake and exuberant roaring 20s, well, guess what happened at the end of the 1920s, the Great Depression. And if we continue to grow as we're currently growing in a completely unsustainable way, we're going to have crash after crash. So, but let's be optimistic. The whole moonshot story is an optimistic message, but definitely we need to have the directed growth towards inclusion, sustainability, using the SDGs as a guiding light, but really getting different types of actors together to turn them into moonshots. And then we can roar together.
Thank you for that warning, but also for that last optimistic message. Thank you so much, and arrivederci. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Mariana, Isabel, Peter, and Paul, and a big thank you to all our guests here tonight, and of course at home as the audience. Of course, the weekend's edition of The TED and L'Echo will have a special magazine and new insights on sustainability and social responsibility with best practices from companies and much, much more. We're ready now to stretch our legs to the beat of compact disc dummies. Feel free to stick around and join in, and I hope to see you live and well at our next edition of New Insights. Good night!
Turn